I'm Bridget Byrne, Professor of Sociology at the University of Manchester and the Director of the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity Code. I'm extremely pleased to welcome you to this first event of the 4-day conference that is organised in partnership with the Stuart Hall Foundation and the Runnymede Trust on racial inequality in a time of crisis. First, I want to tell you a little bit about CODE, very briefly. The Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity is a research centre based at the University of Manchester, but bringing together colleagues from 10 universities across the UK. Our current research programme looking at COVID, race and ethnic inequalities seeks to provide a rapid response to the crisis posed by COVID-19 and its social, cultural and economic impact on racial and ethnic minorities. We're a multidisciplinary team using a range of different methods and seeking to provide robust evidence on the often lethal impact of racial and ethnic discrimination and inequality. We aim to provide new data and accessible formats to champion policy and institutional change by showing where and how racial inequality is present, how it builds on and extends existing patterns of inequality, and how this is experienced in everyday lives. We've launched what we hope will be the largest survey of its kind of ethnic and racial and religious minorities and how they've been impacted by the pandemic. The survey is called EVENS, the Evidence for Equality National Survey, and I'd encourage you to fill it in. There will be more information at the end of the seminar. We're very clear at CODE that the impact of racial and ethnic discrimination and disadvantage are not one-off events, but processes that happen across the life course and across all aspects of lives of individuals and communities. We want to understand those processes, but also working with a range of partners, we want to think about how communities are challenging discrimination and disadvantage, particularly in the wake of Black Lives Matter. We're really pleased to have this partnership with the Stuart Hall Foundation. We take on Stuart Hall's call for the aim of academic research on race and racism to change the world by challenging racial injustice and discrimination. We also collaborated on with the Stuart Hall Foundation on the Stuart Hall Race Report, which came out in February of this year, which summarises the policy recommendations that have been presented over the last 40 years of tackling racial inequality in Britain, also produced with the Holick Family Foundation. We know what the problems are, it's time for change. So I'm really pleased that we're opening this 4-day event with a panel entitled Policing the Crisis, which is of course a reference to the classic book published by Stuart Hall and others in 1978 of the same name, which provided a groundbreaking way of studying the policing and race relations. It tracked the way in which the moral panic around the racialised figure of the mugger paved the way for authoritarian policing of Black communities. We're at a different conjunction now where the mugger has perhaps been replaced by the gang member or notions of county lines, but the analysis still has power. And as we face the new crisis of the pandemic and the ways it's been used to justify the extension of police powers, I think it's critical we examine what the impact this has had on policing and on the policing of racialised communities. I hope you find it informative. Please follow CODE's work on Twitter, Instagram and the web, and consider attending the other events in this week-long conference. Tomorrow on health and well-being, Thursday on employment and young people, and Friday on culture and cultural activism. Now I want to hand over to Scarlett Harris, who's going to introduce and chair the event.
Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us, and thank you Bridget for that introduction. My name's Scarlett Harris. I'm a researcher at the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity, CODE, at the University of Manchester, and I'm really delighted to be chairing this evening's panel, which is, as Bridget mentioned, entitled Policing the Crisis, a nod to the late Stuart Hall and other cultural studies scholars. This evening's panel will explore experiences of policing during this very unique moment. As Bridget has already spoken to, this moment is so unique both in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic and the policing of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the Black Lives Matter movement, both of which have been marked by the deaths or incomplete lives of minoritised people. Panelists tonight will also be exploring the kind of campaigning and the activism that has emerged in response to these conditions, as well as the factors that perpetuate continued policing by force. I will be introducing our brilliant panel in a minute, but first of all, I just want to remind people, for anyone tweeting, that the hashtag is hashtag COVID Inequality UK. So without further ado, I'll introduce our panel, then I'll just say a word about the format of the discussion. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Patrick Williams, who will hopefully appear on screen now, like magic. Patrick is a lecturer and a researcher based at Manchester Metropolitan University, and he's also a researcher with the Code on a project alongside myself and other colleagues. Second of all, speaking on tonight's panel is Leslie Thomas, who is Professor of Law at Gresham College and visiting Professor at Goldsmiths, as well as a QC at Garden Court Chambers. So I'd like to invite Leslie to also turn his camera on. And finally, joining us this evening, we have Deb Coles, who is the Executive Director of Inquest. Hi, Deb. And Inquest is really the UK's leading charity on state-related deaths, or exploring state-related deaths. So the format of the discussion is going to be, we're going to have a 10-minute presentation from each of our brilliant panelists, followed by 30-minute more free-flowing discussion. Hopefully each panelist will be able to kind of speak to each other's points of conversation. And then finally, we're going to have a 15-minute question and answer session to finish off. And I invite you to post questions, comments, any thoughts in the chat box at any point in time during the discussion, and hopefully we'll be able to speak to those towards the end. So I think that has covered everything in terms of an introduction. So I think without further ado, I'd like to invite Patrick to speak.
Good evening, all. Scarlett, thank you for that introduction. Firstly, what I'd like to do is just extend my thanks to the Stuart Hall Foundation, to Code and the Runnymede Trust for organising this, what is an important event. The following presentation, short presentation, will be informed by a number of research projects that I've been involved with recently, but more importantly on a piece of work I've been collaborating on with both Remy, Joseph Salisbury and Scarlett Harris, but also alongside Dr. Lisa White from the University of Lincoln. And collectively, we are collaborating on a study which is related to the coronavirus pandemic and its social, cultural and economic impacts on racial, ethnic and religious minorities. And specifically, our work explores the policing of minoritized groups and communities. And the work we're involved in is made up of two distinct but interrelated components. However, taken together, what we're investigating is the first-hand accounts of the policed, foregrounding their voices in order to support an understanding of policing, including violence, which is arising as a concerning feature of policing under coronavirus restrictions. So this project has also been supported by a number of community groups and organisations and aims to explore the more personalised accounts of interactions with the police, paying particular attention to the factors that may drive up these police encounters. I'm also fortunate to be on this panel with both Deborah and Leslie, and I want to use the opportunity to maybe think through some of the work that we've been involved with in terms of making sense of these increasing negative experiences of being policed. So from the outset, we focus our research attention on the coronavirus pandemic, and specifically the provisions made within the Coronavirus Act 2020, which includes measures to increase police powers. Now, there's a paradox here because this legislation seemingly coincides with the significant national and global BLM protest in response to harmful policing practices and the fatal consequences of our encounters with the police. So for us, in of particular interest are the inherent contradictions, therefore, of policing during what is a health pandemic crisis, which is increasingly characterised by the police use of force. So if we look at some of the information coming from Liberty and other analysis of government data, what we can begin to see is that rates of stop and search during the moment of pandemic have increased by 51%, shifting from 22,000 stops up to a significant amount more for black men in London. Minority ethnic people are 7 times more likely now to receive financial penalties than their white counterparts. What we also know is that during the first lockdown period, there was an increase in recorded levels of use of force in 27 of the 37 police force areas who responded. Specifically, within the Met police area, there's been a 26% increase in the use of force incidents, up to 37,000. Also, according to Resistance Lab, an organisation in Manchester, the most recent use of force figures again show an increase in the use of taser. This has also been accompanied by a public commitment by police chiefs to double the number of taser-trained officers on the streets. And what we know consistently is that the increase in policing and use of force is disproportionately experienced by minority ethnic communities, with black people in particular 6 times more likely to be subjected to use of force than any other minority ethnic grouping. I guess for me, however, in reflecting on these figures, is that similar to the publication of statistics on race in the criminal justice system across England and Wales, which is published on a biannual basis and is now in its 30th year, I want to suggest that such figures should be read and interpreted with caution. On the one hand, they are often misread as a representation of crime rates and levels of offending behaviour. They are not. And to be clear, levels of crime during coronavirus have been reducing, alongside the increase in the use of force. At best then, such figures reflect an institutional perspective of policing, an organisational output of monitoring requirements placed upon individual police force areas. As such, and as I've argued elsewhere, anti-police campaigners who are reliant upon such official figures may be increasingly misguided in using this as a source of challenge. So rather than being illustrative of ethnic profiling and racial disparity, I want to argue that such figures are more effective at concealing the subjective experiences of being policed. Such outputs and reports reflect what Krumanivo and Siddy in 2012 describe as writing that others, being characteristic of objectification, where such statistics and reports subjugate our humanity, simply representing our experiences through the simplistic counts and percentages, a quantitative production of textual objects. This in turn marks decontextualization of experiences of being policed. As objects, the experience of being policed becomes abstracted from the structural conditions and context within which discriminatory policing occurs and takes place. Such figures as published are presented as dehistoricized, seemingly presenting the idea, therefore, of racial and ethnic disparity in policing as novel or a new problem. Just as a simple aside, 2021 also marks the 40th anniversary of the Moss Side uprisings in 1981 here in Manchester. For me, it's increasingly concerning that discussions of over-policing and criminal injustice today seemingly now start with the Lamy Review in 2017 and not with the Moss Side Defence Committee reports into the 1981 disturbances. For me, there is clearly a need to recognise such histories in our understanding of contemporary policing within this moment. So our research today is beginning to reveal what is concealed within the official accounts of policing practice. It's apparent to us that there's a need to go beyond stop and search, to go beyond these official figures as a way of better understanding the experiences of being policed during this present crisis. In the report, Being Matrix, which I undertook with Temi Mwale from the Forefront Project, Young people described their experience of being policed in London. One man told me he had been stopped and searched over 200 times. Another young person could not count the number of times he had been stopped, stating it was as normal as putting your clothes on. Within our present study, a young black male recently informed me that he had been stopped approximately 60 times. To go beyond stop and search reveals that young minority ethnic people are increasingly policed with an impunity. For the same young man who I was speaking with as part of this research, his encounter with the police, he was subject to a hard stop and then handcuffed by the police. There was about 10 of them, he said. He went on to say, in that moment, you have to be a lawyer, a negotiator, a hostage negotiator, and then you've got to be yourself, the hostage. And he concludes by saying that if you fail in your negotiations, they'll take you hostage. There is a trauma in that moment, revealed through his direct reference to Mark, who was similarly subject to a hard stop and then fatally shot by the police. That Mark Duggan's name was evoked, using only his first name in our conversation speaks to our community memories, a collective trauma that extends beyond Mark's tragic encounter with the police. It seems self-evident that the increased risk of being stopped and searched by the police increases the risk of violent and fatal encounters at the hands of the police. To be policed with such impunity reveals what Akwasi Owusu-Bemba theorizes as a mutual disdain from the police to the community, and in turn, from the community back to the police. However, there is also seemingly a police disdain for the rule of law, a point that I'd like to pick up later with Deb and Leslie. Given the levels of policing revealed through the perspectives of those who are policed, a colleague of mine suggested that significant over-policing is better understood as being governed not by the rule of law, but by the rule of police. Echoing this, Joe Lepore suggests we need to draw a distinction between keeping the peace of the streets as different and distinct to the justice administered in the courts. What we have to recognize is that this rule of police, according to Banton, writing in the 60s and developed by Sivanandan, is governed more by a popular morality than by the letter of the law. It is this rule of police which is increasingly devoid of accountability, evading scrutiny through the deliberate establishment of an apparatus and a language all of its own. A language that speaks not of violence, but of deficient and unhealthy bodies that became unwell. It is a language that speaks of restraint, that neutralizes the fatal use of force by the police. By way of conclusion then, in thinking about our research in this way, we hope to surface the continuity of crisis, or what Garland refers to as a perpetual sense of crisis, in order to reflect upon policing its experience within this moment. As a team, we are minded to resist the propaganda prevalent in police accounts, which to date have served to legitimize police-related deaths and deaths in police custody. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. That was a really brilliant way to kick off the discussion, and I'm sure that Leslie and Deborah will want to respond to those points. Leslie, I'd like to invite you to make your contribution now.
Thank you, and thank you, Patrick. What you have said very much dovetails into the talk that I want to address. Let me start with a poem which I think just epitomizes how we as Black people, and I'm not using Black in the political sense, I'm using Black referring to people of African Caribbean heritage, by a 9th grade student in the States last year, Adeola Ayula. I ain't welcome here no more. I walk down the street and guess who I meet? The men in blue who are supposed to defend, but instead they chose to apprehend. They slap, punch, choke me red. They won't stop until I end up dead. Oh, stop, please, I can't breathe. I beg of you, just go and leave. My cries of all despair, out of sight. I'll end up dead if I try to fight. His knees up against my throat. No one can stop him. They're all too remote. My God, what country do we call this? A nation where the pow can just go bliss. At my expense, I kid you not, I'll be beat, stepped on, or even shot. This nonsense must stop. But of course it won't. And all I can scream is, please don't. As I bleed here lying dead on the floor, I know I ain't welcomed here no more. The Metropolitan Police, which covers the London area, issued last year between the 27th of March and 14th of May, 973 fines, who make up about 59% of the London population. White people received 444 fines out of that number. Black people, who only make up 12% of the London population, received 253 fines, or 26%. Asian people, who make up 18% of the London population, received 23% of the fines. A colleague of mine, writing on the Open Democracy website, Michael Etienne at Garden Court Chambers, said this in an article that he wrote last year. Starting first with a street party being held in Cheshire, in the town of Warrington, in full view of the BBC news cameras to celebrate VE Day, it saw people who appeared to be all white engaged in a socially distanced conga holding on to a long rope. No police officers can be seen, and the happy party was able to continue without interruption, despite the footage clearly showing a prima facie breach of legal restrictions on gatherings in groups and some apparent concern by others about the risk of COVID transmission. There was no hint that the attendees would be fined for breaching the lockdown regulations. Zooming out, and moving only a few miles north to Stretford near Manchester, and were confronted with a very different scenario. Also caught on film, a black man who's being questioned by two police officers, it transpires, for driving offences and the breach of the lockdown regulations. It's not clear from the footage why he's then suddenly tasered within arm's reach of his 5-year-old son. The boy can be heard screaming "Daddy" and crying hysterically at the sight of his father incapacitated on the forecourt of the petrol station. The fact that the man went on to admit his offences does not answer the question, why was he tasered in the first place? Nor does it tell us anything about what consideration, if any, was given to the potential impact on his son of his being tasered in such close proximity. The difference in the treatment of black people by the police is stark. You just need to look at the UK Black Lives Matter protests. On the 6th of June last year, mounted police officers appeared to charge at protesters opposing racism in central London. Other protesters were kettled for several hours. When the police began to contemplate releasing people from the kettle, legal observers reported that this was initially on the condition that individuals had images taken of them, this being in direct contravention of a High Court ruling making it clear that compelling someone to submit to recording is unlawful. Black people only make up 3% of the UK population, but 22% of stop and searches. The Liberty report that Patrick referred to earlier concluded as follows. But you see, coronavirus did not create new problems as much as expose pre-existing inequalities. The discrimination exhibited in the use of police powers under lockdown follows the pattern being not just ignored, but reinforced within everyday UK policing. But my friends, this is not new. Humphrey and Gus John referred to young black people who were being seen as projecting something foreign or alien back in 1971. Anthony Lester and Geoffrey Byman referred to a widely publicised lecture delivered by Lord Radcliffe, a former Lord of Appeal and the Lord responsible for partition in India, which echoed the theme of the foreign character of Britain's black communities. Examples of what Lord Radcliffe was reported to have said were that black communities were the guests of the white host community, that they were a large alien wedge, that they carried their colour a flag of strangeness, and all that strangeness implies, that they were rather colonies of immigrant workers and immigrant settlers in the full sense, many of whom would return one day to their homeland, 1972. 1977, Rudy Narayan, in his book, referred to the image of black people as servile and subservient. This is what's been seen in the courts. And of course, Stuart Hall described the damaging effects of the British media's report of mugging from the States, which resulted in the transmission across the Atlantic with all the troubling themes and images that went along with it. You know, there was suddenly the fear of robbery from young black youths. See Bob Semple's book, Race, Bell versus Jail. Even today, in the 2020s, we still have images for these racist views. Men of African heritage in their encounters with the police are often described as powerful with superhuman strength, needing several police officers to restrain them. You see, this problem's not new. When Sadiq Khan was Shadow Justice Minister in 2014, he said in a Guardian article, police officers must remember at all times that one badly conducted stop and search can undo years of hard work and building community relations. We urgently need to revisit the workings of stop and search powers with particular regard to whether the powers are proportionate to the challenges we face. That was 7 years ago. And yet we have the Lamy Review in 2017, which makes it clear that the problem has not been resolved. And we have the statistics that Patrick has recounted this evening. So here's the problem as I see it. The police have to recognise that it is a predominantly white institution. White members of the police force need to understand that questioning the way that things currently are is not necessarily about them being individually attacked, shamed, accused, or judged. These are normal reactions, I suppose, but it's more a recognition that the system in the way it polices black people is unfair and the police as a profession can improve. Accordingly, questions of being good or bad are largely irrelevant. It's a recognition that advantage may well be tied to race, and that is systemic and may well be unconscious. Police officers need to forget the guilt and take action. History matters. The facts speak for themselves. Bias is often implicit and sometimes unconscious. More importantly, it takes great courage to challenge the system. As Peggy McIntosh describes it, I did not see myself as a racist because I was taught to recognise that racism only in individual acts of meanness by members of my group. never invisible systems conferring unsought racial dominance from my group, on my group from my birth. You see, the concept of institutional racism was coined in 1967 by Carmichael and Hamilton when they said, quote, "Racism is both overt and covert. It takes two closely related forms. Individual whites acting against individual blacks by acts of by a total white community against the black community. We call these individual racisms. And then you have institutional racism. The first consists of overt acts by individuals, which causes death, injury, violent destruction of property. This type can be recorded by television cameras. It can frequently be observed in the process of commission. The second type is less overt, far more subtle, less identifiable in terms of specific individuals committing acts, but it is no less destructive of human life. The second type originates in the operation of established and respected forces in society, and thus receives far less public condemnation than the first type. Stephen Lawrence inquiry, the Macpherson recognised this. I don't need to recount that, that's all well known. But here's the problem. Britain's most senior police officer, Cressida Dix, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, insisted that she was not in denial over the police treatment of black people and ethnic minorities, but suggested everyone knows that Scotland Yard has a zero tolerance policy on racism within their acts. But when being tasked about institutional racism, then Cressida suggested that the term had a contested definition. She said, quote, "I think it means all sorts of things to different people. I don't think it's helpful," she added when talking about institutional racism. I make 2 points. Unhelpful to who? And secondly, who are we trying to help? Because it's not good enough to say everyone knows what racist behavior is when they see it. It's not good enough to say that calling out the problem will make it worse, because that's essentially what she's saying. As Carlo says in his book on natives, those of us fighting racism are met with, "Why do you keep on talking about it?" The accusation here is twofold. Somehow, that by highlighting the problem with racism within the police, the messenger is making the problem worse. If we stop talking about it, it will go away. Well, I say this. Firstly, this comes down to victim blaming, particularly if the messenger is the person who's the target of the racist treatment, action, or policy. Secondly, this reminds me of Donald Trump's assertion in 2020 about COVID. Just ignore it and somehow it will magically go away. This is the ostrich approach. Leave it alone and hope it will go away and sort itself out. But you see, my friends, racism is like a cancer. You just cannot ignore it. It needs attention, it needs to be treated, and sometimes it just needs to be cut out. I say the Commissioner ought to be saying what her definition is, not disputing other people's definition, and what standards that she holds her officers to, so that we all know what metric she and her force are applying. You see, you cannot hit a target if you don't know what you are aiming for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leslie, for that brilliant contribution. We're going to be hearing from Deb in a moment. I think she's just going to be prepping her PowerPoint presentation as we speak. But lots to think about already in terms of some of those continuities between what Leslie was talking about and Patrick was talking about. So looking forward to the discussion. I'd like to invite Deb now.
Okay, thank you. The brutal murder of George Floyd and the BLM protests were a reminder that deaths in state custody and state violence is a global issue. Inquest work over 4 decades shows that this is both historic and systemic in the UK, set within the broader context of empire, slavery, and colonialism. The history of torture and brutality of the British state can be seen in the forms of racist state practices that also had their roots in the policing and genocide of Irish people, in mass incarceration, the domestic policing of Black British people, the use of police to control poor or socially marginalised people, the targeting of Muslim communities, and the criminalisation of migrants. By examining deaths in custody and detention in their broader social, economic, and political context, Inquest shows that these are the result of structural racism and discrimination and other inequalities. The war on crime, on drugs, the criminalisation of mental health, poverty, the war on terror and the hostile environment, racism and patriarchy are contemporary examples of a long-standing process of social abjection, in which certain groups of people are positioned as others, as disposable, less than human, reinforcing and reproducing the inequalities of power along gender, race, class, and disability lines. Inquest has documented from our work with bereaved families how a disproportionate number of Black people die after the use of lethal force and neglect by the police. And this comes at the sharp end of this continuum of racialized state harm and violence, and connects with broader experiences of structural racism, over-policing, criminalization, imprisonment, and surveillance. The many cases we've worked on show in brutal reality a use of racial stereotyping and profiling that equates Black people with dangerousness and criminality, portraying those who have died following the use of force and restraint as big, black, and dangerous. In cases where people have had mental ill health, additional negative imagery and stereotyping, the mad, bad, and dangerous, has informed their treatment. We know too, of course, of the high rates of restraint used in mental health and learning disability settings that disproportionately impact on Black people, women, and children. These tropes woven into the mindset, culture, and practice of state agents and institutions leads to the all too immediate and easy resort to the use of disproportionate and fatal use of force in general, and restraint in particular against Black and minoritised people and those with mental ill health, a pattern of cases that have been synonymous with state violence, racism, and injustice. Language used by state agents when challenged to defend their action reproduces these very myths and stereotypes that legitimize colonialism, with reference to superhuman strength and unpredictability to legitimize violent and deadly policing. In the same way that Black women in prison are seen as difficult, as a control problem, and have died from neglect by prison and health care staff under guise that they're faking it. Speaking ill of the dead, and indeed their families, is a feature of so many state responses. Instead of acknowledging failures, we've seen attempts to demonize the person who's died, introduce racist narratives, or build up a negative reputation, which creates the idea of an undeserving victim. The narratives of the drug addict, the mentally ill, the gangster, the dysfunctional family, the othering, all attempts to deflect attention away from official incompetence, criminality, or wrongdoing. What Inquest tries to do is tell the human stories of those whose lives were cut short, those incomplete lives, to amplify their voices and those of their families, to challenge state narratives. Our work with bereaved people informs all of our interventions, which are built on demanding social and racial justice and fundamental social change, while campaigning to hold the state and private companies to account for preventable deaths. And our work, particularly alongside campaigning lawyers, has ensured that a more searching set of questions have been raised about state deaths, and help to shine a light on policing and inside closed places of detention, on the violence, ill treatment, neglect, racism, sexism, indifference, and systemic failings that repeat themselves time and again. Despite over 1,700 deaths in police custody and following police contact since 1990, there has never been a successful prosecution of any police officer for murder or manslaughter, despite a pattern of cases revealing unlawful, excessive force or gross neglect. This is not, as the Police Federation said in their recent evidence to the Home Affairs Select Committee inquiry into police complaints, an example of how accountable the police are or the state is. Instead, it is about a wholesale inadequacy in the legal framework to ensure accountability, prevention, and social change. This is one of the most contentious issues in relation to the approach of the criminal justice system to all deaths in custody. Bereaved families have been consistently failed and traumatized by an investigation system characterized by delay, denial, deflection, and defensiveness. At its core are concerns that the rule of law does not apply to the abuses of power or neglect of state agents in the same way as it does to an ordinary citizen. This serves only to create a culture of impunity, which frustrates the prevention of abuses of power, ill treatment, and misconduct. The majority of information that has entered the public domain about police-related deaths has arisen only because of the deceased family and friends' full participation in the investigation and inquest proceedings, facilitated by their legal representation. In the absence of criminal prosecutions, the inquest is the only public forum in which these deaths are subject to scrutiny and where systemic failings and worse can be exposed. And yet there is a shameful inequality of arms and resources, a system that is loaded against victims and their families. Bereaved families and communities have become powerful advocates and activists for change, turning their grief into resistance and galvanized action against injustice. It is this resistance that has seen uprisings and protests across the country in response to the deaths, from the early 80s when Inquest was set up to the present, many of course of which were subject to police and undercover surveillance. From the 20,000 Black people who marched on Parliament after the New Cross fire in 1981, after a suspected racist attack saw 13 young people burned to death and a bungled police investigation that treated families like suspects more than victims, to uprisings in Black communities that have continued over the decades in response to state deaths, and sees a United Friends and Families campaign yearly procession of bereaved families to Parliament. Many of these campaigns have seen social, political, and legal progress. However, Inquest has observed a shameful lack of political will from successive governments to acknowledge, let alone implement, recommendations specifically seeking to address racism and discrimination in policing, health, immigration, and criminal justice systems. Recommendations echo recommendations after deaths in custody and detention across a plethora of reports, commissions, reviews, parliamentary inquiries, inspections, investigations, and inquests. Politicians and senior officials respond with those hollow words and promises that lessons will be learnt. But every new death gives the lie to this promise and causes new pain and trauma to families who've looked for truth, justice, and accountability in the hope that future deaths will be prevented. This is starkly illustrated by the deaths of Sean Rigg, Shani Lewis, and Kevin Clark, 3 young Black men in a mental health crisis, restrained to death under the care of the same mental health trust and the same police force. That these deaths could occur over a period of 10 years illustrates the failure of accountability processes to force the changes needed to prevent deaths. What we can say unequivocally is that had there been the learning and accountability, their deaths might have and indeed should have been prevented. This is not about police training, about police diversity. It is policing itself. It is about why we're not funding emergency mental health services rather than relying on police intervention as the first responders. It is about preventing people getting into the crisis in the first place. From the failure to respect the right to life right to life and dignity and respect, is born another failure to uphold the right to truth, to justice and accountability. The government has sitting in its in tray a series of recommendations about how to save lives and to deliver evidence-led policy. But instead, ministers choose to focus on preserving slave statues, rejecting data-driven policy and monitoring outcomes, and attacking critical race theory and Black Lives Matter. This is also about confronting the consequences of how race, class, gender, disability, and sexuality intersect to place people at even greater disadvantage. The racial and health inequalities that has seen the devastation of COVID deaths in Black and Asian communities. The impact of the hostile environment, especially on so many Black people of the Windrush generation, wrongly detained, deported, and denied legal rights. The unjustified, often unlawful, indefinite immigration detention system, a system that saw G4S officers unlawfully kill Jimmy Mabenga when trying to deport him, restraining him, ignoring the pleas that he could not breathe. The preventable and forewarned fire in Grenfell Tower that saw the deaths of 72 men, women and children, the impact of race and class and the pursuit of profit over safety at Grenfell. The premature deaths of learning disabled people languishing in institutions, and the deaths of sick and disabled people waiting for welfare benefits. Inquest have never compromised in speaking truth to power. Family testimony, evidence-based policy and research has transformed and politicized the investigation of contentious deaths and placed this issue firmly on the political agenda. What our work has made clear is that this is about radical, transformative structural change and rethinking how we address societal harms and racial and social inequalities that prioritizes people's needs and invests in communities. These are conversations that have been energized by the Black Lives Matter protests and the campaigns of bereaved people. This is about how we think about safety in the 21st century, and rather than focus on expanding the remit and resourcing and militarization of policing and building new prisons and more coercive practices, the focus should be on investment in communities and services that focus on harm reduction, drug, alcohol, robust mental and physical health care, education, youth clubs and youth services, affordable housing, jobs, and addressing poverty and inequality. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb, for that brilliant contribution. I'd like to invite Patrick and Leslie to rejoin us now, so we can have a kind of more open, free-flowing discussion now based on all your contributions. I mean, for me, there are so many points of points in which your presentations dovetailed and kind of threads of continuity as well throughout all of them. But actually something that struck me with all your presentations was the issue of language. And that's kind of where I want to start really. And whether that's in terms of the language used in relation to describe, or in relation to how those killed in police custody are described in the wake of their death, or whether that's in terms of, Leslie, you were talking about the definitions which people turn to in order to kind of make sense of the enduring nature of racism in the police. I mean, to what extent can the kind of radical change that you were all speaking to in terms of where we want to go, to what extent can that kind of radical change actually be achieved with the language that already exists? Or, I don't know, do we need a new vocabulary, a new language? So that's kind of where we might kick off. Deb, do you want to come in here? I'm seeing you.
Well, I was just thinking about this because one of the things that's always frustrated me, particularly around the language and around race, is the dilution of language. And when we're talking about structural racism, about how people don't want to call it out, and it becomes increasingly diluted in terms of talking about unconscious bias, or diversity training, and rather than actually naming it. And that's one of the things that, in the Lamy Report, from recollection, and I'm sure I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, I don't think that David talked anywhere in the Lamy Report about racism. And I think in terms of the work that we've done around deaths in custody, it is absolutely clear that we need to name it.
Yeah, Leslie, you've got your hand up.
I think language is really important. I was trying to touch upon this in my discussion, the way that when we want to highlight the facts, basically the facts that Patrick outlined in terms of how many Black people are being stopped, searched, tasered compared to white counterparts, there's a reaction. Oh, are you saying we're racist? Or there's a sensitivity, and you can see that even the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. I think it's unhelpful to talk in terms of institutional racism. Why is it unhelpful? It is what it is. I mean, I think Kendi, in his book How to Be an Anti-Racist, really summed it up really nicely. And in fact, it's not just Kendi. Carlo also touches upon this, but I love this Kendi quote where he says, "It's a flawed and outdated view on racism to believe that the racist is an individual who consciously does not like people based on race and is intentionally mean to them. Such a definition is a deflection which protects the system." When we recognize that racism doesn't necessarily come from individuals, doesn't necessarily need to be conscious, doesn't necessarily need to be intentional, we will be moving in the right direction. Racial injustice and racism isn't a simple binary question. The racist needn't be bad, ignorant, bigoted, prejudiced, or old. The non-racist isn't necessarily a good person, educated, progressive, open, or fair-minded, well-intended, or young. The discussion goes well beyond this. And I think that is what particularly an institution like the police forces need to recognize. It isn't simply a binary question. It doesn't necessarily mean you are necessarily bad as an individual.
Thank you. I guess for me, Scarlett, on the question of language, and I'm looking at you here as well, given the work we're involved with at the moment, there's something really interesting about speaking with family members about their frustrations, anger, and almost re-traumatize them, because the system of inquiry, etc., almost stops them or precludes them from talking about what may have happened to their loved one. So whilst on the one hand, I may simplistically want to refer to such encounters as murder or manslaughter, there's a sense that that language cannot be used in terms of deaths in police custody or deaths in custody. And there's something about how, I think Steve Toombs would talk about how legal language is used as a way of preserving the status quo. It almost begins to obfuscate what we can and cannot say in relation to state violence and the harms that are meted out by the police. So there was something around me really interested in what Deb and Leslie were thinking about that use of language in that space, how we cannot call out not just racism, but how we cannot call out what's happened to our loved ones. The language of, for example, restraint, as I said earlier, almost implies a need for the police to intervene on this individual. The individual became unwell. Family members are concerned with the language of subject. Those dehumanizing tropes which almost serve to objectify their loved one rather than trying to rehumanize their loved ones. And there's something about, does that almost become a barrier in and of itself in terms of moving towards a realization of the realities of that violence and how it impacts upon the families as well?
Yeah, absolutely. When I think it was Deb mentioned the need to name racism. Well, also Leslie, you touched upon it as well, that need to name racism. It really made me think to one of the strands of our work, Patrick, especially the strand that you're doing with the families, and that tension in whether people are able to name racism and the structures that constrain that. Absolutely.
I think with that, and I'm looking at Leslie, sorry, I just wanted to say as well, there's also something quite tragic as well, because whilst we sit here talking about notions of racism and discrimination, and we're looking at you as well, Deb, there's a sense that some families or some individuals who have spoken to are almost reluctant to name it as racism because they're reluctant to go in as the black family who talk about racism. And there's something quite tragic about that within the circumstances of institutional structural forms of racism. Name it. Yeah.
Patrick, it happens with lawyers all the time. You know, the number of cases I've done over the years where, you know, a person's colour and whether they were ill-treated or treated differently, let's say, on the basis of their colour is the elephant in the room. And there is real angst about whether or not you want to raise that in the way that you deal with the case strategically, you know, for fear of perhaps upsetting somebody's died and you're worried about upsetting you know, perhaps an all-white jury, you know. But these are discussions that we have all the time.
Deb, did you want to come in there?
No, and interestingly, all white juries have been the very jurors that have often come back finding, you know, unlawful or excessive use of force. And I think, you know, in a way have been challenged themselves about the reality of what policing is. You know, the amount of times, I think, Leslie, I'm sure you'd agree, that we've been in situations where we've come out of inquests and jurors have said, oh my God, why didn't we know this kind of thing was happening? Or why is this kind of thing happening? And that happened at the conclusion of the recent inquest that Leslie did into the death of Kevin Clark. And, you know, a group of jurors who were, I mean, it was a mixed group of jurors actually, but who were absolutely brilliant in calling out every single thing that they thought and you know, identified as being wrong, which was around kind of, you know, systemic violence and neglect, violence from police, neglect by mental health services. But I think you know, Leslie's that right in terms of, you know, what we've called over the years, you know, the elephant in the room, because and I do think that actually some of the conversations around this have been energized by the BLM protests. I mean, and also not forgetting there are, you know, a lot of families out there who do speak absolutely, you know, the reality of, you know, the violence that has killed their loved ones. You know, there are many voices, and I think those families have really helped people understand, you know, the reality of the treatment that has resulted in deaths across, you know, across a variety of different settings. There was something, Scarlett, that I wanted to pick up from Patrick's presentation and around collective trauma.
Yes.
And you know, what I would call intergenerational trauma, because I do think that what is often forgotten when we're discussing, you know, I mean, you know, there is to put yourselves in the situation of families whose loved ones have died at the hands of the state, who then face, you know, all these protracted investigations and processes that go on, you know, many years, and never actually achieve, you know, the justice or the accountability that they want. And even when the truth is established, then see nothing actually happening, you know, to police officers at an individual or at a kind of senior management level, and then see the the same things happen again. You know, that is trauma, and that is trauma that lasts for, you know, generations. And I thought, Patrick, you know, your point about you know, the reality of what happens on the streets, you know, I know from talking to a lot of families with, you know, young people, particularly Black young people, the fear of them going outside the front door as to what the potential is that could happen. Because I think, you know, we know from, you know, we know from our work, and, you know, I didn't talk about, you know, the long list of names, but we're all, you know, we're all familiar, you know, to them. But the increased arming of the police with, you know, ever, you know, more sophisticated weapons, not least the repeated resort to force, use of force, whether that is, you know, restraint, or whether that's tasers or firearms, you know, that is the reality. And we've got, you know, families whose, you know, generations have been impacted, because those families have been forced to try and fight, and often fight, you know, takes over their whole lives.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up the issue of trauma, Deb, because that was actually one of the words that I wrote down as you were all presenting, because I did feel like that was a thread through all your contributions. And Leslie, you talked about the individual in Stretford who was tasered in front of his child, and the kind of immense trauma that represents really for him and his family. I suppose, carrying on with this theme of trauma, and I'm wondering how we recognise and talk about trauma and collective trauma and intergenerational trauma, as you mentioned, Deb, in a way that is sensitive and ethical in the different spheres of work that we're all involved in. And Patrick, I'm looking at you because this is a conversation that we sometimes have with our colleague Lisa White at the University of Lincoln, because she often sort of she's very good at thinking about the effect of the media in terms of the circulation of videos, traumatic videos, and we saw that especially in the wake of the killing of George Floyd and the kind of explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement last year. And so yeah, so that's my question really, you know, how do we navigate this question of trauma in a sensitive way, but also be able to recognize the kind of the gravity of it really? Patrick, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I do. I think this, whilst we pose a question and then we're posing the how do we, there's still something about almost surfacing and beginning to reveal almost the presence of trauma. And it, just listening to Deb speak then, I recall doing my doctoral research a few years ago, and I was speaking to a man who was in his 50s, and we were discussing racism and the experiences of racism and discrimination. And I remember his reflections on the day he realized, he said, that he would never belong in Britain. And he was in his 50s. And he reflected back in this conversation to Clinton McCurbin, who died in 1983. And he recalls that he must have been 13, 14, 15 years old. And he said he recalls the front page of the newspaper and recalls what had happened to Clinton McCurbin. And he says it stuck with him ever since. And that's what informed him about this sense of belonging, this sense that it would be really difficult for him to really claim Britishness. And that's what we're speaking about because of what happened to Clinton McCurbin. And there's something about that trauma that whilst we have the families, there's that collective memory within communities that we recognize that this happens. It's a feature of our lives. And it serves as significant disruptions for us as we go about our everyday lives. And there's something really important about that notion of collective memory. But there's also something, and just to briefly move on, but there's also something about how we attempt to try and identify some notion of accountability. And this is some of the things we've been thinking through. And I know this may sound like a bit of an aside, but the use of the mobile phone to capture those moments is a really interesting one for young people. Because on the one hand, it's about trying to gain some notion of accountability, but then also the tensions that young people, and not just young people, but people are grappling with, because they believe by pulling out the phone, they may exacerbate the situation with the police and in fact, increase the likelihood of violence being used against them. And there's just that tension in terms of being able to think about what is happening in that moment of being stopped and searched in that police encounter, and how that in and of itself becomes traumatic whilst you're trying to deliberate how to navigate and manage this and attempting to de-escalate. And the strategies that are adopted. So yeah, that's some of the conversations that we've been thinking about and trying to reflect on, and all symbolise that the significant impact of that on well-being, on sense of self, becomes really important to reflect upon.
It's interesting, Patrick, though, that you one of the things you mentioned was around previous encounters with the police, and I think you and I were talking the other day, and in the situation with Kevin Clark, he had previous encounters with the police where he'd been tasered and he'd been absolutely traumatized and was fearful, and that was something that the mental health agencies knew. And yet, of course, at the time when he was going into crisis, it was the police response that ultimately cost him his life. And I think I often kind of question the links between trauma and then mental ill health and going into crisis, which then, rather than being treated as that kind of public health need and response, is then subjected to a criminal justice response, which ultimately can be fatal.
Just on that conversation as well, Deborah, wasn't there the conversation? There's an individual who I was speaking to the other day who spoke about what was an extensive history of racial harassment or harassment by the police, and somehow an emerging tension that doesn't become a feature of those inquiries, that somehow the event, that the death is what marks the start of this process, whereby they felt it almost ignored that extensive history and family history, not just the individual, but other family members who experienced this harassment by the police. And again, we're interested in thinking through, well, what does that mean and how does that impact on well-being and the traumatic episode? In fact, the individual who we were speaking to said that one of the brothers turned around and said, well, look, they've got one of us at last. Almost like that death marked the end point of that level of harassment. And there's something about how does that play out in terms of thinking about how we respond to this level of state violence.
I think that ties really nicely into a question that we've actually had from one of the audience members, because we've been talking a bit about trauma and about the kind of enduring trauma of police racism and harassment and violence. And we've got a question from someone specifically directed to you, Patrick, but I'm sure that other panelists will have something to say as well. The question is, how do you observe the constant policing and awareness of constant police presence to affect the health of individuals and communities? And I think this question of health is a really interesting one, especially in the context of COVID and the pandemic, when the police are often invoked in relation to public health. So I don't know if you want to speak to that, Patrick, and then maybe, because since the question was directed specifically to you.
Sure, yeah, I think we've actually touched on that as well. And I think that the anecdote of speaking about the doctoral research, where I think there's something about whether we allow children to go out. At what points do we allow children to go out? What should children be wearing? I've spoken to individuals who talk about changing what they wear, shifting how they present themselves as a way of trying to divert attention from the self. as a way of trying to avoid policing. And there's something quite tragic about that sense of trying to shift and manage yourself. I think there's more work, I've read more work being done in the States in terms of how this impacts upon not just children and young people, but the wider family members. But I do think there's a time, and it's right to begin to think about, well, what is the impact of being stopped and searched on young people? And I was speaking to a number of litigators the other day, where we increasingly don't even think about the notions of stop and search and the encounter itself, and we increasingly become reliant on the numbers, well, 10 times more likely or 20 times more likely. But when we did the work again on the Matrix research, we spoke to young people who were 12, 13, 14 years old, who spoke about, in that moment, being scared because this big white bloke came up to me and stopped me in the street and says, right, we're going to go into your school bag. And these were young people who, in the interview, in the conversation, spoke about wanting to potentially be police officers, but the significant disruption that encounter evokes in these young people just almost contributes to, and I'm going to use this language sensitively, but it was almost the emergence of an anti-authority attitude, because that authority was almost abusive to those young people. It wasn't that they were intrinsically anti-authority, it's just that they were traumatized by these episodes of being children and young people and the experiences of being policed. I do think we need to go further in terms of thinking through, well, what are the longer term effects upon young people in those encounters of being stopped by big men when you were a school kid.
Absolutely. Deb or Leslie, do you want to come in with a comment there?
A couple of things.
Yeah.
Firstly, I think it's important to recognise that this does have an impact, as Patrick was saying, on young people. You just need to look at the poem that I started with. You know, that was a grade 9 student, you know, and there's so many poems by kids on the website flowing from George Floyd's death last year, and even before George Floyd's death, because there's so many you know, black people being killed in the States, and you know, just the feeling and the emotions to construct a poem like that. You know, the poem is wonderful and it's beautiful in its simplicity, but you know, you can feel the pain behind it. And although it was a poem that was written in America, it applies equally. I ain't welcome here anymore to a number of black kids in the UK. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second point I wanted to, if I can just take it a step further in terms of the conversation, in terms of solutions, right? One of the solutions that I think that, you know, I talked about a recognition in terms of languages and concepts of racism. The racism isn't necessarily an individual, it can be the system. But I think no discussion is complete on this topic without touching upon privilege. Because, you know, I think it's important to recognize that you cannot take out the privilege of whiteness, or the privilege of whiteness cannot be taken for granted. And I can just give a few examples as to how white privilege in the context of policing makes a big difference. So just having a positive relationship with the police generally, that's a white privilege. Not having negative media images being biased against your race being thrown at you every day, being able to escape the violent stereotypes associated with your race. And we touched upon this, the big black bad type image, being able to call out racism and not be accused of oh, you're playing the color, the color, you know, the race card, whatever playing the race card means. You know, why is it that it's always black people who play the race card? If a white person calls out something as being racist, they're not accused of playing the race card. But if a black person calls out the very same behavior, they're accused of playing the race card. You know, being insulated from the daily toll of racism, being ignorant, being ignorant. Oh, I didn't realize it was so bad. You know, that's privilege. You know, to be able to say, oh, I really didn't think it was so bad for black people. That is privilege. Anyway, let me get off my soapbox.
Thank you, Leslie. It's been a brilliant discussion so far. I want to try and squeeze in one more question from the audience before we have to wrap up. I can't quite believe how quickly time has gone. So I've got a question here from Kathy Nugent. Forgive me if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Which I think is a good one to end on, because it resonates with what you were speaking towards, Leslie, in terms of hinting at solutions, really, or questions about where we go from here, which also feels an appropriate place to end on. So Kathy asks, it feels as if the movement around BLM here had a less developed debate about demands than the movement in the US. Clearly, a very big part of what we have to demand is refunding and restoring public service, living standards, etc. I think that's something you've all spoken to today. What should our key demands specifically about curbing police powers, strengthening ways of holding the police to account, ending mass incarceration, and so on be? So a question about key demands, really, moving forward.
I mean, if I just start, but just by noticing that they brought out, the government brought out the police crime courts and sentencing bill today, which looks like, you know, increased prison sentencing, increased, I think there's going to be 20,000 new police officers, cracking down on protests. I mean, serious human rights, I think, concerns about this new legislation. 10-year prison sentence for statue toppling. I mean, you know, it's so, you couldn't make it up. So, I mean, you know, I think I mean, I said in my presentation, I think this is much more about kind of radical transformative change. And I think a lot of the discussions that bereaved families are having is around, what does justice look like? You know, imprisoning a few police officers, you know, that doesn't dismantle structural racism or structural violence. But what does is, you know, stopping the police being the call out for people in mental health crisis, as an example. I was actively involved in campaigns around abolishing women's prisons, and Baroness Corsten's report, all of which recognised, you know, the futility of the kind of prison industrial complex, as it's called, and how prisons just don't work. And yet we're building more prison places. We're building 500 new prison places for women. And the justification was, oh, well, because we're going to have more police officers on the streets, so we're going to have more people sucked into the criminal justice system. You know, so I mean, I think having some proper conversations about, about what does defunding really mean, and talking about what we mean when we talk about investing in communities, in healthcare, in jobs, in, you know, housing, and, you know, poverty and inequality being the key things, you know, at a time of austerity. And you know, at the moment, the billions of pounds that we pump into police and prisons, you think what we could do with that money.
Any remarks from Patrick or Leslie, thinking about moving towards closing remarks now as well?
Sure. I guess for me, in relation to, there's an ongoing conversation, isn't there, around defunding and what the strategies should be within the UK context, and for me as well in the European context and some of the work I'm doing there. I guess rather than not answering the question, there's something for us, something for me about thinking about policing in its widest form. So rather than seeing police in that uniform, recognising that policing is delivered in a myriad of different ways now. With the emergence of private security, the policing of certain young people in very different spaces. It's interesting that the harms and violence can be meted out by individuals who are not police officers or PCSOs, but are private security officers. So something about the defund argument doesn't lend itself to those more private forms of policing and that extended policing. So there's something about us having to think more differently or more creatively in terms of how we respond to that wider notion of being policed. But equally as well, for me, I think in terms of a transformative approach, it is something about beginning to respond to the needs of individuals rather than those imagined and constructed risk that are often attributed to Black and brown bodies. And once we begin to undermine and disrupt those notions of risk, then we can begin to respond to the needs of individuals, which will better serve, for me, notions of justice.
Can I just say, just very quickly, in terms of solutions, it's depressing to hear the new act that is being proposed that Deb just made reference to. You see, no matter how much we tinker around the edges, and we have, you know, fluffy training on unconscious bias, nothing's going to happen until there's a real will and determination. I'm going to end with this quote from James Baldwin, one of my favorite authors. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced.
Thank you, Leslie. I think that's a very appropriate point to finish on. But before we completely say goodbye and good night, I would first of all like to thank all the panelists for your contributions this evening. It's been for me a really interesting discussion. It's felt like we could have gone on for a lot longer. I'd also like to remind the audience, just before you hop off, of the Evans survey, which Code are running at the moment, the Evidence for Equality National Survey, which we should, at the end of the discussion, if I think I'm right in thinking we'll have a slide up shortly with a link to that survey. If you're able to participate in the survey yourself, that'd be brilliant. Please do, if it applies to you. And we also encourage you to check out the survey and learn more about it. We'll all be there through the link. I think that is everything in terms of from me and our panelists. So thanks again to all our panelists, and thank you to you, the audience, for tuning in. Please do check out the other events running this week as part of the Racial Inequality in a Time of Crisis conference. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Take care.